The darkness of the night hid her tears, and the fragrance of the billionaire's rose garden masked her final, desperate prayer. All she wanted was a place to bury her friend. But when Elias Thorne, the richest man in the city, saw the small, muddy mound, his billions couldn't buy him away from the truth. He didn't just see a trespasser. He saw the faint, hidden scar behind her ear, the mark of a conspiracy he thought he'd buried forever. This wasn't an orphan. This was a weapon. And now, the men who built her were coming to get her back. The city breathes, but it does not sleep. It is a great, grinding machine of concrete, ambition, and perpetual motion. Down below, in the shadowed canyons between glass towers, life is cheap, loud, and fast. But look up. Look far above the clamor, where the air thins and the sound dampens. You find a different world. A place carved out of privilege, walled off by iron and indifference. This is where Elias Thorne reigned. Elias Thorne, the name was a monolith in the financial districts. He didn't just control industries, he seemed to command the very flow of capital. His mansion sat atop the highest ridge overlooking the sprawl, a fortress of obsidian stone and silent surveillance. To the people below, he was less a man than more a concept, cold, untouchable, utterly distant. He possessed everything, yet for years he had possessed nothing that truly mattered, sequestered inside his own meticulously ordered silence. But even a fortress has boundaries, and sometimes the quietest life holds the deepest, most painful voids. For Lila, the world was not measured in stock indexes or quarterly reports. It was measured in heartbeats, in the fleeting warmth of sun on cold pavement, and in the rhythmic scratch of a tiny paw against her threadbare coat. Lila was 10 years old, a small shadow navigating a city that preferred its children to be unseen. Her eyes, and this is crucial, were not just dark. They held the deep, bruised violet of exhaustion and unshed tears. They were eyes that had seen too much hunger and too little kindness. They were the eyes that would one day stop Elias Thorne in his tracks. Lila had one possession, one anchor in the chaotic sea of her existence: Pebbles. Pebbles was a scruffy, mismatched terrier mix, all ears and nervous energy, but to Lila he was the repository of every secret, every hope, every fragment of love she had ever managed to hoard. They were two tiny satellites, orbiting each other in a vast, uncaring universe. They lived in the forgotten spaces, the service alleys, the hollows beneath abandoned stairwells. They knew hunger intimately. But there was one place Lila knew, a place that felt like an impossible, breathtaking dream, and it was on the edge of Thorne's domain. The estate wall was impossibly high, a seamless barrier of dark granite. But nature, as always, finds a way. Decades ago, a massive oak tree, ancient and stubborn, had managed to grow right up against the inner side of the perimeter wall. Its roots, thick as pythons, had cracked a single, narrow fissure in the stone, just wide enough for a determined small child and her dog to squeeze through. This crack led into the Thorne Rose Garden. It was not just a garden, it was a meticulously curated paradise. Manicured hedges formed silent, geometric mazes. The air, trapped within the high walls, was thick with the intoxicating perfume of thousands of roses, crimson, ivory, deep brooding black velvet. Lila didn't know the names of the flowers. She only knew that here the noise of the city was muffled to a gentle hum, and the biting wind seemed to stop at the wall's edge. This clandestine space, this pocket of impossible beauty on the edge of tyranny, was Lila's sanctuary. She and Pebbles would sneak in only at dusk, sometimes resting beneath the massive, gnarled branches of the central oak, a silent sentinel overlooking the vibrant blooms. It was the only place Lila felt safe enough to pretend, just for an hour, that she wasn't disposable. But even sanctuaries are subject to the harsh laws of the real world. And the real world for Lila had just delivered its cruelest blow. It happened 3 days ago, a sudden sharp fever that racked Pebbles' small body. Lila, clutching him in the damp chill of their usual alcove, felt the frantic rhythm of his heart slow, then shudder, and then nothing. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Lila had ever experienced. It wasn't just the loss of a pet, it was the final severing of her last tether to warmth and unconditional loyalty. For 2 days she couldn't move. She sat, frozen, clutching the stiff, small weight of her only friend. The hunger gnawed, the cold bit deeper, but the emptiness inside was a heavier burden. She could not leave him in the filth of the street. He deserved the sanctuary. He deserved the perfume. He deserved a burial worthy of a king, even if the king was only a forgotten street dog. The decision, when it finally came, was born of desperation and fierce love. Under the cloak of a moonless midnight, Lila returned to the fissure in the wall. Her movements were practiced, silent, the survival mechanism of a child who knows how to be invisible. Pebbles was wrapped tightly in the shawl that was both her blanket and her only coat. She squeezed through the crack, the rough stone scraping her skin, indifferent to her payload. Once inside, the scent of roses enveloped her, a strange, beautiful shroud for her small tragedy. She carried Pebbles toward the ancient oak at the heart of the garden. The earth there, cared for by armies of unseen gardeners, was soft, dark, and yielding, a stark contrast to the frozen concrete she was used to. Lila knelt. The tears that had been locked tight for 2 days finally broke free, hot and stinging, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She began to dig, not with a shovel, but with her bare hands. Her fingers, small and thin, tore into the rich soil, working until they were raw and bleeding. Every scoop of earth was a final act of service, a prayer whispered into the ground. "You were good, Pebbles," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "You were the best boy. They never saw you, but I saw you. I saw everything." She laid him gently in the shallow hollow, arranging the shawl around him like a royal bedspread. She didn't have flowers to scatter, so she used the only other thing she had, the 2 tarnished, meaningless coins she'd saved for weeks. She placed them on his chest. Then she covered him. Scoop by scoop, she buried her best friend, her only family, erasing the evidence of her love from the world, sealing her grief beneath the soft, dark earth. When the mound was complete, she collapsed on it, not crying anymore, but simply absorbing the terrible stillness of the soil. She pressed her face against the freshly turned dirt, whispering a final desperate plea into the ground, a plea that carried an unintended weight. "Be my dad, and take me far away." It was in that absolute, unguarded moment of utter devastation, as the scent of rare blossoms mixed with the smell of fresh-turned earth, that the silence of the fortress was finally broken. From the deep shadows cast by the mansion's grand veranda, a figure stepped out. Elias Thorne. He was a man accustomed to viewing the world through security monitors and panoramic windows. He had been standing there for minutes, perhaps longer, watching the impossible tableau unfold. The intruder, the tiny, ragged girl, the intimate burial. He saw the ragged clothes, the raw, bleeding hands, and the profound, almost spiritual quality of her grief. His first instinctive reaction was the cold, efficient calculation of a man who protects his assets. Intruder. But as Lila whispered that final desperate plea to the earth, a sound that carried eerily in the still night, Thorne did not reach for his alarm system. He reached instead for the memory of a void inside himself, a void that smelled suspiciously like the absence of a daughter he never had. He saw not a criminal, but a desperate human being performing a sacred rite in the only place he felt had space for her sorrow. He watched as Lila finally pulled away from the small grave, her face a mask of exhaustion and pain, and began the agonizing crawl back toward the fissure in the wall, leaving behind the small, muddy disturbance in his flawless, curated paradise. Elias Thorne did not move until the shadow of the little girl had vanished completely. He walked slowly to the grave, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the disturbed soil. He stood over the fresh mound of earth, the air suddenly thick with the cloying scent of expensive roses. He recognized the scent of his own isolation in that small patch of dirt. He did not understand why she was crying, but he understood the gravity of the act. And as he turned to walk back toward the imposing front of his house, something subtle, a nearly imperceptible. That dramatic setup leads perfectly into the central mystery and conflict. Here is the script for Part 2, The Confrontation and the Glitch, focusing on the tense first meeting and the shocking discovery that shifts Thorne's motivation entirely. The dawn that broke over the Thorne estate was indifferent to the tragedy of the previous night. It was a day like any other in the calendar of a billionaire, marked by efficient silence and the endless, intricate demands of a global empire. But for Elias Thorne, the silence of his study was suddenly hollow. His gaze kept drifting to the eastern wing, where the manicured perfection of his rose garden hid a small, muddy secret. He didn't call the police. He didn't summon his groundskeepers to fix the desecration. He simply waited. He knew the child would return. Grief, he understood, was a form of magnetic pull, a desperate need to verify that a lost thing was still, somehow, there. And he was right. Lila returned just as the sun was burning off the morning mist. She had spent the morning huddled in her usual doorway, the cold having set into her bones. But the need to see the tiny mound once last, to whisper a final, silent goodbye, was stronger than the fear of the fortress. She squeezed through the fissure and ran straight to the oak tree. The grave was exactly as she had left it. She knelt, her small hands digging into the worn pocket of her thin dress, pulling out a precious piece of scrap paper and a broken crayon. It was a crude, hastily drawn image of a happy, bouncy dog, her final, humble tribute. She placed the drawing carefully on the dirt, weighing it down with a smooth river stone. And that was when the silence broke. A deep, resonating voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating stock movements, cut through the rose-scented air. "That," the voice stated, cold and without inflection, "is my property, and you, little girl, are trespassing." Lila froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it once, long ago, in a news report playing in a shop window. It was the voice of power. She didn't dare turn around. Her small body seized up, her mind racing through every possible punishment: jail, the cruelty of a police officer, or worst of all, being sent back to the man she had escaped.
Thorn was only 10 feet away, standing near a towering rose bush. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, an impossible figure of wealth against the backdrop of natural beauty. He was severe, imposing, and his expression was a carefully constructed mask of disinterest. "Turn around," he commanded, his voice still measured. "You owe me an explanation." Lila slowly rotated. Her bruised eyes, wide with panic, met his. The sight of her, the sheer vulnerability, the tattered state of her clothes against the backdrop of his wealth, did not soften him. He was testing her. He wanted to see how she would respond to authority, to fear. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice a barely audible squeak. "I didn't mean he was sick. I didn't have anywhere else. It's the only safe place I know." She gestured weakly at the grave. Thorn followed her hand. He took in the small mound, the faded drawing, and the sheer desperation reflected in her face. He was about to deliver a rehearsed, cutting lecture on the violation of privacy and the sanctity of property, the standard billionaire response to being disturbed. But then, the accident happened. As she tried to back away, her heel snagged on a stray root from the massive oak. She lost her balance and tumbled backward, a small, involuntary cry escaping her lips. In the clumsy scramble to catch herself, the shoulder of her oversized, patched-up sweater slipped down her neck. For just a fraction of a second, the material pulled taut, revealing a small, stark expanse of skin just behind her left ear. And on that skin there were not one, but two impossibly precise details that made Elias Thorne's blood run cold. First, a series of faint, pale surgical scars. They were thin, almost invisible, but their pattern spoke of a complex invasive procedure. Second, nestled right behind the curve of the earlobe was a tiny, almost microscopic dot of dark, polished metal, a sealed port. It looked like an old, crude version of a neural interface. Lila recovered quickly, tugging the threadbare wool back into place. But the damage was done. Elias Thorne, the man who prided himself on seeing everything, who built his fortune on the bleeding edge of medical technology and neural computing, had just witnessed a glitch in the matrix of his world. His lecture evaporated. His mask of indifference shattered. His eyes didn't look at her face anymore. They were focused entirely on the spot behind her ear, seeing a decade-old technology that should have been illegal, or at the very least, completely extinct. "Stop!" Thorne's voice was no longer cold. It was sharp, urgent, and laced with absolute certainty. It was the sound of a scientist confirming a decade-old theory. "Do not move. Show me your neck." Lila froze again, her panic returning with tenfold ferocity. This was it. This was the moment she always knew would come. The man who put that thing there had always warned her that anyone who saw it would either want to hurt her or claim her. She instinctively covered her neck with her hand, shaking her head violently. "No, sir, please. It's nothing. It's just a birthmark." Thorne took a step closer. His eyes narrowed, the vast distance between the billionaire and the beggar suddenly erased by a shared, dangerous knowledge. "That," he said, the words heavy with hidden knowledge, "is an NDI port, an old-generation neural data interface. They were experimental. and they were all supposed to be deactivated years ago. He stopped, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Where did you get that, child? And what were you doing with Project Chimera? The sheer, terrifying accuracy of the name Project Chimera was like a physical blow to Lila. How could this rich, distant man know the secret code word used by the shadows who had controlled her life? The truth of her situation became chillingly clear, that Elias Thorne was no longer interested in her trespassing. He was interested in her secret. He was interested in the technology that had been implanted in her as a child. The grief over the lost puppy was suddenly secondary to the sheer existential terror that her deepest vulnerability had just been exposed to the one man in the world who possessed the power to exploit it. Lila didn't wait to hear another word. She made a desperate, panicked dash for the wall, scrambling to re-enter the anonymity of the city. But Thorne was faster than she expected. He lunged forward, not to hurt her, but to block her exit, his hand grasping her shoulder just as she reached the crack. Don't run. Thorne's grip was firm, but not cruel. I won't hurt you, but I know what that is, and if I know it, others know it too. Tell me what they did to you, Lila. Tell me everything. He released her, stepping back just enough to prove he wasn't a physical threat. Lila stood panting, trapped between the towering wall of the mansion and the terrifying knowledge in the eyes of the man who owned it all. The sanctuary was gone. Now only the secret remained.
The tension in the rose garden was now palpable, thick enough to choke the fragrant air. It was no longer about a buried puppy or a trespasser. It was about Project Chimera, a ghost from the shadows of bioengineering history and the tiny girl who was its living remnant. Elias Thorne was a man who traded in information. The name NDI port had immediately reorganized his world. He wasn't looking at a street child. He was looking at a decade-old, highly classified piece of hardware, a piece of technology Thorne himself had only read about in sealed black market journals, rumored to be able to turn a human mind into a hyperprocessor. Lila, backed against the cold granite of the wall, saw the sudden fierce intensity in his eyes. It was worse than anger. It was ownership. She braced herself for the demand, for the inevitable cruelty that always followed the exposure of her secret. But Thorne, a master strategist, understood that fear paralyzes, but hope motivates. I am not going to call the police, Lila. I am not going to tell anyone you're here. In fact, I'm going to do the opposite. He paused, letting the silence build, forcing her bruised eyes to look at him. You can stay here. I'll give you food, warmth, and clothing. No one outside these walls will ever know your name. He gestured toward the small mound beneath the oak. You can come to your friend's grave every day. You will have a safe space for the first time in your life. Lila blinked. It was an offer beyond her wildest, most desperate imaginings. But she was street smart. She knew no gift from a man like this was ever truly free. Why? She whispered, her voice barely scratching past her dry throat. Thorne walked closer, stopping just a respectful distance away. I want answers, he said simply. I want to run non-invasive tests on that device. I want to understand how it works, how they controlled it, and most importantly, how to deactivate it completely. If that thing is active, Lila, you're not just running from a cruel foster father. You're running from the corporate entity that designed it, and they have unlimited resources. He painted the true picture of danger for her,
not as a threat, but as a chilling reality. He wasn't just offering sanctuary, he was offering a shield. The unspoken bargain. Lila, starved for safety and exhausted by running, saw the terrible truth in his eyes. He wasn't lying about the danger. The man who put the device in her was always terrified of the corporation finding her. She nodded slowly, sealing the pact, not with a handshake, but with a silent, desperate surrender. And just like that, the street orphan was ushered from the dark alleyways into the sterile, breathtaking luxury of the Thorne mansion. Life in the mansion was a jarring dichotomy for Lila. She was given a guest suite that was larger than any apartment she'd ever seen, soft sheets, unlimited hot water, and a kitchen stocked with food that smelled like heaven. Yet she was treated not like a granddaughter, but like a precious, priceless, and highly dangerous artifact. Thorne kept his distance. He assigned his most trusted silent housekeeper, Mrs. Helen, to see to Lila's physical needs. But Lila was primarily his subject. The heart of their interaction took place in Thorne's vast private lab, 2 floors beneath the mansion. It was here, surrounded by gleaming silver consoles and softly humming diagnostic equipment, that Lila's painful past began to unfold through cautious questioning and careful observation. The echoes of Project Chimera. Thorne started the questioning gently, almost as if he were interviewing a colleague. Lila, tell me about the man who put this here. What did he call it? Lila huddled on a soft leather chair, hugging her knees. The memories were fragmented, painful, and often hidden behind the scar tissue of trauma. She revealed that her father was a strange man who mostly kept her locked in a dark room with screens and numbers. He called it the Chimera Engine, she whispered, revealing the dark origin. He said I could see things no one else could. He used me to play with the big screens. The play, as Lila called it, was actually real-time data analysis. The man was using her neural interface to feed complex, encrypted financial or security data into her mind. She wasn't just viewing the data. Her brain, boosted by the NDI port, was processing it, identifying anomalies and predicting market crashes or security failures with perfect accuracy. She was a living oracle. Thorne confirmed his darkest theory. Project Chimera was the attempt to create a human predictive model, a person who could calculate complex real-world variables faster than any supercomputer. The technology was deemed too dangerous, too invasive, and shut down after ethical scrutiny. Lila was the sole survivor and proof that the project had, terrifyingly, succeeded. He realized the severity of the danger. The man Lila fled was likely just a disgruntled rogue scientist, using Lila for his own small gains. But the original creators of the technology, the powerful corporation Thorne suspected was behind the initial funding, would stop at nothing to recover their successful investment. Lila represented not just a profit source, but a massive security risk if she fell into the wrong hands. The growing threat. Thorne spent the next 3 days and nights lost in old databases, encrypted files, and dark web forums. He was tracing the faint digital footprint of the original project. Every search he ran, every coded access he attempted, was a digital flare gun fired into the dark. The narrator reveals that the NDI port in Lila's neck wasn't just receiving data, it was transmitting a low-frequency beacon, a digital pulse, a check-in signal. When Lila used her abilities, the signal spiked. While he had her safely locked away, the beacon was quiet. But the moment he started running diagnostic checks on her, the signal stuttered, confusing the original tracking system. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the electronic environment around the Thorne estate. And deep in the heart of the city, In an unmarked skyscraper, a single red light flashed on a decades-old terminal. They knew. The corporation had been patiently waiting for years for the Chimera engine to report back. They had been waiting for the rogue asset to finally reveal itself. And now, thanks to Thorne's well-meaning interference, the signal was no longer silent. It was disturbed. Thorne looked up from his glowing screens, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach. He hadn't just given the little girl sanctuary, he had inadvertently put a giant spotlight on his own house. He walked up from the bunker lab and found Lila asleep in her luxurious new bed, a faint smile on her face, finally tasting true rest. Thorne looked at the peace on her face and then down to his vibrating phone, where a coded message from his head of security read simply, "Perimeter anomalies, unknown surveillance." The bargain was over. The game of scientific curiosity had turned into a desperate fight for survival.
Elias Thorne stood over the sleeping girl, the soft light of the expensive room masking the cold dread he felt. The coded message from his head of security was clear. They were here. The gentle diagnostic pulses he'd run on Lila's NDI port hadn't just located her. They had pointed a bullseye at his fortress. He knew he had only minutes to act. He had to understand the Chimera engine's full capability, not for science anymore, but for survival. If he could activate the power and predict the attacker's moves, they might stand a chance. Thorne woke Lila gently. Her wide, bruised eyes were immediately alert. He skipped the pleasantries. "Lila, we're out of time. The people you were running from are here. They are watching the mansion right now." He didn't need to elaborate. The terror in her face was confirmation enough. "I need you to trust me," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I need to know what that device can truly do. I need you to use the Chimera engine right now. It's the only way we can predict their entry point and escape." Lila hesitated. Using the device was always agonizing. It felt like her mind was being crammed with 1,000 voices, a constant, overwhelming cascade of data. It was the reason she ran. "It hurts," she whispered, tears forming. "He always made me see the bad things, the crashes, the failure points." Thorne knelt down, his billionaire austerity replaced by genuine desperation. "I know, Lila, but today you'll use it to see the escape route. You'll use it to protect yourself. You are in control now." The full secret is revealed. Thorne led her to his lab, bypassing all the slow, cumbersome security protocols he'd used before. He placed a simple, non-invasive headset over her temples. On the massive, curved monitor, he projected a live, real-time feed of his entire estate's external security blueprint, the digital nervous system of the mansion. "They will attack the weakest point," he explained, pointing at the screen. "You need to tell me where that is and exactly when they will breach the perimeter." He engaged a low-level frequency, a careful digital whisper that nudged the NDI port. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a sharp gasp. On the screen, the static-laden data feed surrounding the perimeter blueprint suddenly began to shift and glow. Lines of code flowed across the visual map like water finding a drain. It wasn't just showing the security status, it was showing the security status in the future. Lila's body tensed up. The NDI port was working, flooding her brain with a horrifying stream of complex variables: sensor failure probability, timing of the guard patrol route, velocity vectors of a high-altitude drone. "The south wall," Lila gasped out, her eyes still shut, her voice strained. "The old greenhouse section. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. The thermal sensors have been zeroed out. There's a gap."
Thorne, stunned by the instant, precise information, didn't hesitate. He was looking at real-time predictive data. Lila wasn't just calculating, she was seeing probabilities with superhuman clarity. The truth was fully revealed. She was a weapon, a flawless, living algorithm. "What else, Lila? The extraction team, how many? How will they approach the house?" Thorne demanded, already typing commands to secure every point except the south wall, setting a trap. "3 men," Lila whispered, trembling. "They won't come to the front. They will use the utility tunnels. They are looking for the lowest power signature. They want to sedate me and take me. They are avoiding the library. They think you're in the library." The hunters arrive. Thorne's face, usually calm, was etched with grim realization. They knew his habits. They had been observing him, perhaps for years. "The utility tunnels," he muttered, pulling Lila off the chair. "That leads directly to the sub-level garage. We're going. Now." Just as they raced toward the secret staircase, the entire mansion was plunged into sudden darkness. The emergency generators kicked on instantly, bathing the lab in a sickly red glow. But the brief flicker was enough. The breach had begun. Lila's body seized up again. This time, the NDI port wasn't just processing, it was reacting to the immediate proximity of the attacker's hostile jamming technology. She cried out, clutching her head. "They're close, Thorne. They're right beneath us. They're not men. They are mercenaries, and they know about the rose garden. They're looking for the spot." Lila's final revelation was a chilling twist. The mercenaries weren't just after the girl, they were after the evidence of her attachment. They knew the emotional significance of the burial site and were using it as a psychological pressure point. Thorne realized that leaving Lila's safe space, the memory of Pebbles, vulnerable, was a tactical error. He pulled Lila down the narrow escape stairs toward the sub-level garage, his mind racing. His fortress had failed. He had brought the danger, not the protection. As they reached the concrete floor of the garage, the heavy steel door leading to the utility tunnels was already groaning under heavy pressure. Sparks flew from the hinges. "Get into the car, Lila," he shouted, pushing her toward a sleek armored sedan. "I have to buy us 5 seconds." Thorne reached for a hidden panel, activating a blinding electronic countermeasure, a desperate last-minute digital firestorm designed to overload the mercenaries' jamming equipment. The tunnel door burst open with a deafening crash. 3 dark figures, armed and professionally silent, rushed in, their eyes scanning the garage. Lila scrambled into the back seat, terrified, but her eyes, still seeing the data streams, locked onto Thorne. She saw his prediction, a 98% chance of capture if he stayed put. But he didn't stay put. He jumped into the driver's seat. The tires squealed as the heavy car roared to life, smashing through the reinforced garage door just as the mercenaries opened fire. The vehicle careened out into the pre-dawn streets, its armored shell deflecting the bullets. But the journey was just beginning. Lila looked back through the shattered rear window at the diminishing lights of the Thorne mansion, her fleeting sanctuary, now a besieged island in the darkness. She was running again, but this time the billionaire was driving.
The world outside the Thorne mansion was a terrifying blur of high-speed pavement and flashing streetlights. The armored sedan, a vehicle designed not for show but for war, roared away from the perimeter, a thunderous heartbeat in the quiet residential district. Inside, the air was thick with adrenaline and the metallic scent of fear. Elias Thorne, the man who usually only moved at the measured pace of global finance, was now a wheelman, his focus a steel-trap concentration on the road. He drove not with recklessness, but with the cold, predictive precision of a man who already knew the algorithms of traffic and police response. In the back seat, Lila was a small, trembling silhouette. The Chimera engine, though no longer actively engaged by Thorn, was still overloaded from the rush of data. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the aftershocks, the faint digital whispers of possible ambush points and surveillance camera loops. The very system that was supposed to save her was now her constant, terrifying companion. "They're following us," Lila gasped, her voice hoarse, pointing back at the reflection of a dark, fast-moving van gaining on their tail. "Two cars. They're trying to box us in at the highway interchange. Exit 4B. Thorn didn't question the prediction. He swerved violently onto a secondary service road, executing a maneuver that only years of expensive, specialized training could perfect. The mercenaries' van shot past the interchange, falling for the digital ghost Thorn had predicted Lila would expose. The chase was a symphony of chaos, but it was punctuated by long, agonizing silences, the vast difference between the constant noise of the street and the oppressive silence of the car's armored cabin. In one of these silences, Lila finally found her voice, asking the only question that truly mattered. "Why? Why are you helping me? You're risking everything. You could have called the police and been safe. Why?" The billionaire's confession. Thorn glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his profile grim in the passing lights. He had always been defined by his ambition and his impenetrable control. But in this moment of life or death, the protective facade cracked. The cold, calculating billionaire vanished, revealing the guilt-ridden man beneath. He slowed the car, pulling into the shadowed, deserted parking lot of an abandoned factory, a secure, silent spot Lila's prediction had certified as clear. He cut the engine. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling metal. Thorn turned, his face finally visible in the dim interior light. He didn't look at Lila, but at the place behind her ear where the NDI port was hidden. Project Chimera wasn't run by a rogue scientist, Lila. It was funded by the Thorn Group. It was a shell company, a black ledger operation that my father and I authorized to push the boundaries of neural processing. Lila stared, the revelation hitting her with paralyzing force. Her protector was her creator. The man she had sought refuge with was intrinsically linked to her greatest source of terror. My father called it optimization, Thorn continued, his voice laced with bitterness. He saw the orphans, children like you, as blank slates. He promised me it would be used to help children with severe learning disabilities. But the truth was always about profit and prediction. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The program was shut down when the ethics board found out. Most of the early subjects were recovered, but 3 children vanished before deactivation. 3 children, including you. When I saw that port on your neck, Lila, I didn't see a scientific discovery. I saw my original sin. He swallowed hard, the magnitude of his guilt palpable in the car. My father died 2 years ago, but the project's data, and the men who ran it, never vanished. They became a shadow entity, waiting for their weapon to resurface. I couldn't save those children then, but I can save you now. This is not charity, Lila. This is atonement. The new mission. This confession shattered the wall between them. The fearful victim saw not a captor, but a man wrestling with monumental responsibility. The scientist saw not a specimen, but a human being he was honor-bound to protect. The bond was forged in the fire of shared guilt and immediate danger. They won't stop, Thorn stated, his eyes now hard with renewed focus.
If they take you back, they will weaponize you and erase any evidence of your escape, including me. We can't deactivate the NDI port without the original primary server. That is the only place we can cut the signal and burn the data that links you to them." Lila, now calmer, the terror replaced by a steely determination, spoke with the authority of the Chimera engine. "The primary server is at the original research facility," she said, tapping into the fragmented data stream the port still provided. "It's a sub-level bunker, disguised as a defunct power station. It's 30 miles northeast. If we go now, we can be there before their main team arrives." She wasn't begging anymore. She wasn't running aimlessly. She was calculating, strategizing, and commanding. The weapon they created was now being turned against them. Thorne looked at Lila, seeing the fire and brilliance of the human mind they had tried to confine in technology. He simply nodded. "Then that is where we go. It's time to finish what my family started." He started the engine, the armored car peeling out of the lot, heading for the dangerous final destination, the very core of the secret that had haunted them both. The journey to the abandoned power station, the disguised Project Chimera research facility, was a tense, silent pilgrimage. Elias Thorne drove with the unwavering resolve of a man purging a generational curse. Lila sat beside him, the fear replaced by the cold, focused clarity of the Chimera engine. She was no longer just seeing threats, she was calculating victory. They reached the sprawling, dilapidated structure just before dawn. It was a concrete husk, abandoned to rust and ivy, the perfect camouflage for a dark secret. "This place is riddled with traps," Thorne muttered, peering through night vision goggles. "Their main team will be here soon. We have minutes to find the server." Lila's hand shot out, pointing precisely at a single unmarked metal grate near the foundation. "That is the maintenance access. It bypasses the primary locks. The server room is on the lowest sub-level, shielded by 3 encrypted layers. They want to keep it safe from everyone." Thorne, moving with brutal efficiency, breached the grate. They descended into the cold, silent darkness, guided only by the faint digital whispers Lila could hear. The ultimate test. They found the core facility, a sterile, modern bunker deep beneath the earth, and there, waiting for them, was the man Lila knew only as her father, the rogue scientist who had been using her for years. He wasn't alone. The 2 remaining mercenaries from the chase were with him, guarding the massive, humming server rack. "Thorne," he sneered, his face a mix of surprise and malice. "You should have stayed in your castle. You've brought me my property, and now you forfeit yours." He pointed a weapon at Lila. The threat was immediate, terrifying, but Lila didn't shrink. She looked past him, her eyes locking onto the blinking lights of the primary server. "I need access to the server terminal," Thorne commanded, stepping forward. "We can destroy the data, cut the signal. We end the project now." The scientist laughed. "It's locked down with a triple-layer quantum encryption. Even your billions couldn't buy a program fast enough to break that code. It would take a supercomputer days." "Good thing I brought one," Thorne responded, his eyes flicking to Lila. Lila knew what she had to do. This was the final, devastating use of the Chimera engine. If she connected, she would have to process the entire history of the project, her life in seconds. The strain could be catastrophic. Thorn raced to a small isolated console, quickly patching a single thin data cable to a hidden access point on the NDI port behind her ear. "This is it, Lila," Thorn warned, his voice soft but firm. "One last time. Focus on the deactivation command and the data erase sequence, nothing else." Lila closed her eyes. The world dissolved into a blinding flood of code. Her mind became the battlefield. She wasn't processing numbers. She was processing the truth of her own captivity. Her consciousness stretched and burned under the impossible load. On the server screen, the security walls began to fall. Layer 1, Layer 2. The scientist, realizing what was happening, fired his weapon. Thorn shoved Lila behind the server rack, taking the hit himself, a grazing, painful wound to his shoulder. The final surge of power ripped through Lila's mind. She screamed, but it was a scream of triumph. Access granted. The server screen turned black, then flashed a single, terrifying word: erasure. The scientist's terminal went dead. The NDI port in Lila's neck emitted a faint final spark and then went completely silent. The Chimera engine was dead. The data was gone. Lila was free. The new dawn. The ensuing scene was swift. The mercenaries, their payroll gone and their target secured by a higher power, the CEO himself, fled the scene. The injured scientist was neutralized by Thorn's private security, who arrived minutes later, guided by a coded distress signal. Thorn, his shoulder bandaged and his expensive suit ruined, watched as a medic checked Lila. She was physically exhausted, but whole. The tiny, insidious metallic port, the mark of her enslavement, was now nothing more than a deactivated shard of plastic and wiring, soon to be surgically removed forever. Weeks passed in the silent comfort of the Thorn estate. Lila, now receiving counseling and education, began to heal. The bruises around her eyes faded, replaced by the tentative light of true childhood. She was still quiet, but she now possessed the greatest luxury of all: a future. The final scene returns to the rose garden. The earth beneath the ancient oak, where a dead puppy was buried, is now covered in the most vibrant, freshly planted blossoms. A small, living memorial to the dog that saved her. Thorn walks into the garden, looking less like a CEO and more like a tired, relieved father. He holds a crisp legal document. He doesn't offer a grand speech. He simply sits down on the stone bench next to Lila, who is sketching contentedly in a new bright red diary. "Lila," he says softly, handing her the papers. "This is final. The courts, they approved the petition. You are officially part of the family now." Lila takes the papers, but she doesn't read them. She looks up at Thorn, her eyes full of a new profound trust, not gratitude, but belonging. She doesn't have to beg for a father anymore. She has one. "Can we get a new dog, Dad?" she asks, the simple word settling naturally between them for the very first time. Thorn smiles. A genuine, warm smile, a sight never before seen by anyone in his professional life. "Absolutely, but this time we'll give him a proper home." The little girl, who had only ever known to bury her secrets and her sorrows in the cold soil of a stranger's garden, had finally found a home and a father in the heart of the one man powerful enough to conquer the ghosts of her past.